Howdy folks, and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Sim 2020, and we're still sticking to the theme of places where I've been. Although, we're actually starting off with some place that I haven't been. This is Robben Island in South Africa, just off the coast of Cape Town. It was fortified during World War II as part of the Cape Town harbour defences. A whole bunch of 9.2 and 6-inch guns were installed. But it's probably more famous or infamous for being the site of a maximum security prison from the 1960s onwards during the apartheid era. This is where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned. It's not a prison anymore, it's a museum, but most of the museum guides were former prisoners. It wasn't always a maximum security prison, although for the best part of the last 400 years Robben Island has been used mostly as a place to dump people that society didn't have any better idea what to do with. Before it was a maximum security prison, it was a leper colony and a mental asylum, although not necessarily all at the same time. And out there is Cape Town. Now, I have not been to Cape Town, although my friend Eddie has, on various ships that he served with in the Royal Navy, and he says it's a fantastic place, and I've got no reason to doubt him. But we're going to take a look anyway, because it's the location of one of South Africa's more impressive landmarks. And you can already see it, of course. Table Mountain. Now, having never been to Cape Town, actually I should probably say that I've never actually been to South Africa with the Navy at all, but that doesn't mean I haven't been to South Africa. I used to live there between 1982 and 1986. I lived in various different places all over South and Southern Africa. Cape Town, however, was not one of them. So I've seen pictures of Table Mountain, I've seen pictures of Cape Town, but you get a different appreciation for what it all looks like from the air. And the first thing that I noticed, which isn't the massive flat mountain in the background, although that is pretty bloody impressive, but the thing that initially struck me when I saw this was, is it just me, or is that the cone or caldera of a massive volcano that erupted and blew off a section of the caldera wall? Because that's exactly what it looks like. We're just flying over Cape Town Stadium. It is said that Cape Town, Cape Bay and Table Mountain were first discovered in the year 1488 by the Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Dias. Although I suspect that the area had probably been discovered by the Bantu tribes that lived there a good couple of thousand years earlier. Dias named the area the Cape of Storms, and for good reason, although it was renamed a couple of years later, presumably in an effort to stimulate trade and exploration by the Pope, as the Cape of Good Hope. And in 1497, yet another Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, following in Diaz's footsteps in attempting to establish a southern trade route around Africa to India, once again caught sight of this place in the year 1497. Oh, hang on a minute. There's a very important landmark down there. Do you see this? That's the Castle of Good Hope, built in the 17th century by the Dutch East India Company, and the best preserved example of a Dutch East India Star bastion type fort in the world. And that's it down there. It's interesting though, because Table Mountain itself, as we take a look out over the bay, the dockyard, the marina, but Table Mountain itself only actually looks like a table from this angle. Once you've sailed around the Cape, it doesn't look anything special at all. So if history had happened the other way around, if it wasn't the Europeans, primarily, or initially at least the Portuguese, but later the Dutch, the French, and the English, who were trying to establish that trade route, if it had been, for example, the Indians who were trying to establish a trade route around the southern Cape of Africa to Europe, they wouldn't have thought there was anything special coming from the other direction. Who can say? But that is definitely 100% a volcanic caldera. Now the far side of Table Mountain, you can see it just kind of slopes down gradually towards sea level. You can see the switchback roads leading up to the top there. But that slope leads down to an area that's called Stellenbosch. And Stellenbosch is where they grow probably the best wine in South Africa. Well, they don't grow the wine, they grow the grapes, which is then cultivated and pressed and blah blah. You get the idea. Some exceptionally good white wine is grown in that area right down there. But like I say, I've never actually been to Cape Town, and I certainly never lived here, but I did live in other places in South Africa. In the year 1982, at the tender age of 12 years old, shortly after the Falklands War, my family emigrated from the city of Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England to this place, the city of Newcastle in Natal province in South Africa. Yes, I know, from Newcastle to Newcastle. What an amazing coincidence. Newcastle was first known as just Post Halt No. 2 on military maps in the 1840s because it was pretty much just a place where postal couriers stopped to change their horses and have a bit of an overnight rest. As you can see, it's grown a little bit since then. It's currently what's now known as KwaZulu-Natal province's third largest city. But let's not get too carried away here. It's KwaZulu-Natal's third largest city. It's not like California's third largest city. It only has a population of 365,000. The stimulus for all this growth and expansion occurred in the year 1890 when the first train arrived in Newcastle and coal was discovered, which in 1920 led to the Union Steel Company founding a steel mill here. Later on in the 20th century, the Union Steel Company became ISCOR, the Iron and Steel Corporation of South Africa, and they built their biggest steel plant here in Newcastle. And a whole bunch of skilled craftsmen were encouraged to emigrate to South Africa to work for ISCOR, and that's why we ended up here. And so what I'm trying to do now is find out where I went to school and where I lived. The problem is that it doesn't have a huge population, but it's kind of like Los Angeles. It's spread out over a massive area. However, by a stroke of pure luck, I did manage to find my old high school. And we're flying above it right now. That is Barberton High School, Newcastle, KwaZulu-Natal Province, Republic of South Africa. That's where I went to school. It's the tennis courts, the rugby pitch, which means that I must have lived, if I can remember my directions, over there. It was within walking distance of the school. That road that you can see running the length of the school, that's actually it's not abandoned, it's a railway track, which would have been used to deliver coal to the steelworks, although it's out of use today. Let's switch to the showcase camera and see if I can find my house. So the school is the red-roofed complex of buildings just there on the right-hand side. Most South African schools, at least built during the 60s and 70s, tended to follow the same rough pattern. But that kind of black line there, that's the old railway track. It might be a road now, I don't know, but at the time in 1982 it was a railroad track. Which means that my house, where I used to live, on Andreas Pretorius Drive, in the Barry Herzog Park residential area of the city of Newcastle, would have been right about... Oh, hang on a second. Let's just get rid of this bloody warning. There. I've changed the viewing angle for a slightly better view. Here we go. Oh, let's get rid of this. Right, that was our house. This was our garage. That was our next door neighbour's house. And I have no idea what that was. That building was not there in 1982. It was just more houses. The thing that I remember most about Newcastle in South Africa in 1982 was that it was really, really boring because there was just nothing for kids to do other than to get into trouble. And there weren't that many opportunities for us to get into trouble either, but don't worry, that situation would soon change. After around about a year of living in Newcastle, we'd go to school during the week, and then on the weekend the only thing that ever happened was we'd jump into the car and drive down to here. Not sure what it is now, looks like a shopping centre or something, but at the time that was the company club, where you could get cheap beer, and there was nothing for kids to do. We'd basically be given a bottle of Fanta and be told to shut up and be quiet while the adults got down to some serious alcohol consumption. But this situation didn't last very long. After about a year we got an offer of a job for a company known as the Usutu Pulp Company. They were situated in a tiny little country about the size of Wales, and also, like South Africa, part of the British Commonwealth. At the time, it went by the name of Swaziland. I believe now it's called Eswatini. I loved Swaziland, because like me, it was kind of crap. It had one TV station, and It didn't really seem to know what it was doing most of the time. I can remember watching the news one night, and after the news was the weather. And the poor guy who'd been thrust in front of the camera to do the weather forecast clearly hadn't prepared, or something had gone wrong, because he didn't actually know what the weather forecast was. So this guy actually just stood in front of the camera and said, "Tomorrow there will be weather all over Swaziland. And if it is not raining, it will be fine." And that was the weather forecast for the next day on Swazi TV. I loved this place. It was just so endearingly shit. But it was a lovely place to live. Although the education system in Swaziland left a lot to be desired. Don't get me wrong, the country had very, very good primary school education, and most Swazis, that was all they really needed. If you wanted to go to high school, however, you were severely limited in your choices, because most places didn't have access to high schools, and some of the high schools were incredibly expensive. So all of the immigrant families, ours included, in the village where I lived, sent their children to the same boarding school in South Africa, and the village where I lived, in Swaziland, well, we're coming up on its airport now, although I don't remember this being here in 1982. Go on, have a go, try to pronounce the name of that place. I can. I bloody well should, I used to live here. That is pronounced Mhlamanyati. In Siswati, the native language here, that sound, written down as MHL, to pronounce it properly you kind of have to put your tongue, the tip of your tongue between your teeth and blow out. So, Mhlamanyati. Yeah, I know. Actually, years later, when I was working at Fort Blockhouse doing the administration for the medical personnel at the Royal Hospital Hasler, it turned out that one of the radiographers there was from Swaziland. And when he found out that I'd lived in Swaziland, we had a great chat. He was absolutely delighted that he finally found an Englishman who could pronounce the names of the places where he used to live. He was a really nice guy. Swaziland, by the way, or to give it its proper name now, Eswatini, is the last black kingdom in Africa. It used to be part of the British Commonwealth. It was a British protectorate from 1903, and it gained its independence in 1968. It's still part of the British Commonwealth. And when it gained its independence, it originally adopted a constitutional monarchy modelled on the one that we have at Westminster here in the United Kingdom. That lasted about 3 years when the king decided, actually, I don't like that idea. I'm in charge, and it's now an absolute monarchy. It still has a parliament, but the Prime Minister is appointed by the King, and the King has the final say in all matters of law. And that, down below us on the right, is the Usutu Pulp Company. It turns all of the trees in the Usutu forest around us into paper. That's where my dad worked. And on the far side of the river from the paper mill, this is the village of Mhlamanyati itself. It's a very, very small village. There's nothing here but houses and a shop. Or at least there wasn't in 1983 when we moved here. And we lived here for 3 years. See if I can find the house where we used to live. This down here is actually a golf course, or it was in 1983. No idea if that's still true now. But we lived on Simba Crescent, which I think I can see, and we lived on this side. Again, there are some unfamiliar buildings that have obviously sprung up in the intervening years, but that right about there, that right there was our house. Now, there was a primary school here, which was fine for my baby sister Philippa, but my other sister, Wendy, and myself were high school age, and there wasn't a high school within 50 miles of this place. So we all went to school at a place called Barberton in what used to be called the Transvaal province of South Africa. And this is it, nestling in the foothills of the Maconius Mountains. Barberton didn't exist prior to 1881 until gold was discovered here. And there was a bit of a gold rush. Before too long, they built a stock exchange here, the first stock exchange to be built in the whole of Africa. And the facade of the stock exchange still exists in Barberton town centre today, although you can't see it in Microsoft Flight Sim. I'm going to leave the aircraft parked in active pause mode over the town centre while I take the drone camera out for a look around. There was a lot of money made by a lot of people very, very quickly in Barberton, and certainly back in 1984, that was reflected in the kind of houses that you could see on this side of town, on the slope, looking up over the mountains. You can't really see it now, but I had a girlfriend at the time who went by the name of Charmaine Sawyer, and she lived on one of the houses on the hill up here. And I remember the first time I saw where she lived. Even in 1984, we wouldn't have got an awful lot of change out of $1 million for the house that Charmaine lived in. And she went to the same school as me. And that school is down this road here. The complex of buildings just up ahead with the red roof. That is Barberton High School. And this is the boarding complex. This is where I lived. So boys were on this side with the juniors on the top floor, the seniors on the bottom floor. Girls were on the other side. Same deal. Juniors on the top floor, seniors on the bottom floor. This was where the teachers lived, those who didn't have their own homes in the town. This place here in the middle was the dining hall on the ground floor, and the study hall where we did our homework on the top floor. This building at the back, that was where the kitchen and the laundry were located. Down here we've got the tennis courts. This was a netball court. Actually, it was a whole bunch of netball courts. These were the actual school buildings themselves. So these were where the classrooms were located. The school, like I said, was fairly well off. It had its own swimming pool. And sometimes on the weekends, we'd be allowed to use that if the weather was particularly hot and the teachers were in a good mood. This big open green area here was the parade ground. At the time, there was a very, very strong militaristic tradition in South Africa. So all boys did military training on Fridays, which normally meant just marching around with cadet uniforms. These, difficult to see here really, were grandstands overlooking the first rugby pitch. The school actually had two. There was a second rugby pitch down here. And there was a very, it's difficult to see here properly, but that was a very, very steep slope leading down from the first rugby pitch to the second rugby pitch. Now, on the far side of the second rugby pitch, you're in the Wild West. That was all basically just jungle. Well, as jungle as it gets in South Africa. That was an area that was known as the Donga, which is a very, very narrow creek that's carved itself a passage out, and thanks to the presence of water, it's just overgrown with vegetation. Bit of a jungle. So on a weekend, we'd all club together whatever pocket money we had, and then a couple of brave souls would volunteer to go through this, sneak down through the rugby fields, through the Donga. Once you got out of the Donga, there was some farmers' fields here, subsistence farming basically, and then this was an area of town that was quite unfortunately referred to as Coolie Town, because it's where most of the Chinese and Indian immigrants lived. And there was one department store here. There were a couple of shebeens where you could buy alcohol, but you tended to get mugged more often than not if you went to somebody's house to try to buy beer. But there was a very accommodating department store. It was called Patel's. Had an Indian proprietor. I think this is it here, actually. It's in the right spot, this big white building. And they would sell you alcohol, no questions asked, as long as you had the money. Usually all we could afford was old brown sherry, and that is absolutely as disgusting as it sounds. It's kind of like Portuguese port, but nasty. And something that was known as clipper cane spirit, which is basically distilled sugar cane. Very popular in Brazil, where it's the principal ingredient of the Brazilian cocktail caipirinha. But the South African stuff was like drinking methylated spirits. But it was cheap, and it's what we could afford. And we'd smuggle this stuff back through the Donga, and then we'd all camp out on the bottom rugby pitch because you couldn't be seen when you were down there, and we'd have ourselves little parties on the weekend. Now, if you wanted to actually sneak out of town, you had to go out here, and you had to be careful because that was Mr. Potgitter's house. He was one of the teachers. And you didn't have a lot of choice about it because this was the gate, and everything else was fenced off. So you had to kind of sneak out and hope you didn't get seen, and then you'd come up here, which was Sheba Drive, I think. Oh, that was... I had a friend in my class called Billy Rovati, son of Italian immigrants, and he lived right there. That's his house. It actually looks like his house, which is kind of surprising. There was another girl in my class called Celeste Morrow. And she was extremely wealthy too. She had a house over there, which was an old Cape Dutch mansion. It was absolutely beautiful, but you can't see it here in Microsoft Flight Sim, which is a bit of a shame. Anyway, carry on going up Shiva Drive. And then you'd turn right here, and there was a shopping complex, which was down here somewhere. Oh, that's it. There it is. Now remember, this was the 1980s, and VCRs were only just becoming a thing. But here, as well as an amusement arcade where you could play Space Invaders and Galaxian, there was a video shop. And I had another girlfriend at one point. I can't remember her surname. Her first name was Verity, and she used to have a part-time job working here, which meant that she had the keys. So I used to borrow the keys from her on a Friday, give them back to her at school on a Monday, and I'd basically spend all of Saturday night with a couple of friends in there watching all of the horror movies that we weren't supposed to watch at the tender age of 15 and 16. Like I said, there wasn't an awful lot of opportunity for kids to get into trouble in Newcastle, but there was plenty of opportunity for us to get into trouble at boarding school here in Barberton. One of the other things that we used to do when we sneaked out on the weekends, because you weren't allowed out of the boarding school, it was like Stalag Luft 13. But up here in the Maconius Mountains is where all of the old gold mines were. Now, this was incredibly dangerous, and it's a miracle that we all lived to see our 16th birthday. But if you headed up into the mountains along this trail here, and it was quite a trek, but eventually you would come to a tunnel. There was a roundabout here, and that tunnel led clean through the mountains and came out the other side. And I'm not talking motorway tunnel here or anything, right? This was something that was dug out of the mountains by hand by the gold miners in the 19th century. So it was very narrow, and it was pitch black. There was no lighting in there at all. So we'd buy a packet of candles and some matches before we went in. But it must have been 2 or 3 miles long, and it was freezing in there. But eventually it led out over here, and you got this view. And that is where I went to boarding school in South Africa. So I hope you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane, because that's it for today. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.